Welcome and well met, my fellow adventurers, and thank you for joining me here for today's lesson. Thanks to all the information we've gotten in recent days on the history of Etheirys, I thought it could be hard to try to keep track of it all. So what I am going to be doing now is start a series of videos that will be compiling all that we know of Etheirys' history since the time even before the Sundering. So please sit back and enjoy as we walk through the history of this world. So to start off with, I'm going to quickly explain how the timeline works. The world's history is divided into alternating periods of calamities, or umbral eras, and times of peace, known as the astral eras. Simply put, the umbral eras are periods of calamities or natural catastrophes of great destruction and change, and are thereby followed by periods of prosperity and calm, the astral eras. So the timeline was set at the very end of the 6th astral era in 1.0 before the 7th umbral calamity, and 2.0, A Realm Reborn, continues after that during the 7th umbral era before shifting to the 7th astral era by the end of the base game. So at the beginning of each astral era, the year starts back at 0, such as year 1 of the 7th astral era, which is what happened at the end of A Realm Reborn. So with this, we have at least a base idea of how the timeline works, as well as basic events. But before all of this, we will have to go way far back into the past, the prehistory before the Great Sundering, back when the world was still whole, before the source and the shards were created. So we don't have an exact time period of this prehistory, except that it seems to have taken place over 13,000 years ago to our modern day. We also know that the world of Etheirys was inhabited by a race of beings who were so powerfully magical they could weave their ether, their very life force of all living beings, into many different forms through creation magic, meaning that they could literally create anything out of seemingly nothing, provided that they had enough ether, even going as far as creating new life forms that they felt could benefit this star. Unfortunately, we really don't have too much information other than that, but we do know that there were at least a couple places that were confirmed to have existed during this time, such as in the form of Elpis and Pandemonium, which are both facilities that were used for testing creations. Elpis mainly for testing new creations and seeing if they would be able to benefit the star before being released into the world, and Pandemonium, which was really more of a testing facility for very powerful, very dangerous creatures that were deemed too dangerous to be released into the world, but too valuable to destroy. And we also know of the main capital city of Amarant. So Amarant was overseen by a form of government known as the Convocation of 14. They were the group of people who were the top experts in their various fields. Many people have sat upon these seats before passing their titles on to successors, which is basically how their government worked. Otherwise, all that we know for sure about this world is that it was nearing a state of perfection, and I believe that had it gone on for much longer, it could have very well have become a perfect paradise. But at this point, we'll never know for sure. But anyway, let's go ahead and move on to the big events that happened during this time. So roughly between 13 to 12,000 years ago, we know that a researcher who was once head of Elpis but later would become a member of the Convocation with the title of Vandaniel, would create the catalyst that would change everything. Hermes was his name, who hated how most of his people seemed to disregard the lives of their own creations, and thus began his great mission to explore distant worlds in the universe, to basically try to find the answer to the meaning of life. To do this, he created a being known as Meteon, who could interact with a form of energy known as Dynamis. To explain what Dynamis is in simple terms, it is an unseen power in the universe that is affected by emotions, but we'll explore more about Dynamis another day. Anyway, because Medion was created by Dynamis, she had a very powerful affinity to be able to control it, but also to be able to feel the emotions of all those around her. Hermes also created Medion's many sisters, also known as the Metia, and he was the one who directed them to explore the universe and see if they could discover more life out there. To communicate, he created them with a hive mind so that no matter how far away they were able to still communicate with each other through some kind of telepathy. And so long as he kept Medion by his side, then the other Metia could still speak to him through Medion. Unfortunately, this journey was not destined to turn out well. It was a complete disaster that ended up changing the entire world forever. Now, despite the fact that Hermes had the best of intentions, what he did not take into consideration what would happen if the Metia found something bad out there, which was basically what happened. The Metia ended up finding many planets that were either dead or close to dying. In fact, the Metia were even directly responsible for the deaths of some of these planets. Because of all the suffering that they had seen, they came to believe that to live is to suffer, and so they must resolve to end that suffering to free others of such pain. This pain was so extreme that it ended up affecting the Medion that was left behind on Etheirys. She was the one who ended up telling Hermes of all of these dead planets and their fates. Unable to process this shocking news, though, Hermes decided to give mankind a chance to prove them wrong. As such, he helped Medion to escape Etheirys while also wiping away the memories of all who discovered the same truth, save for a former member of the Convocation named Vana, who learned of the future calamity that Medion would bring to them. At some time after Medion ended up fleeing Etheirys, she must have met up with her sisters and built their nest at the edge of the universe, Ultima Thule. That's where they began their Song of Oblivion to stagnate Etheirys' ether. The resulting natural disasters warped the ancients' creation magics, which caused them to accidentally create monsters from their fear and despair. The entire world was soon set aflame and countless people were killed in the process. The world was clearly dying and no one was spared from the suffering until all that remained was with the city of Amarant. But even the capital was reduced to ash before the end. To stop this, the ancients combined their powers and sacrificed about half of the world's remaining population and even one of their own Convocation members to summon forth their god of Zodiark, a creature of darkness who also had the power of motion and change, thus causing the stagnant ether to flow once again. Because of this, they were able to halt the calamity as well as creating a barrier of ether to keep Medion's song from causing more destruction while they worked to restore the cycle of life. This event was known as the Final Days, and they were just barely able to pull themselves back from the very brink of complete and total annihilation by the skin of their teeth. The remaining Convocation members, minus the one bearing the title of Azim, who left before Zodiark summoning because they did not approve of such a loss of life, worked to try and rebuild the damage that was left behind. The problem is that they needed to rely upon Zodiark once more to bring more life back into the world. So another sacrifice of half of the remaining survivors of the Final Days was offered to bring life back and restore much of the damage. However, the remaining populace, who were unable to come to terms with what happened, unable to move on from such a tragedy, they decided to nurture the new life on Etheirys so that they could sacrifice them later on. Basically, their plan was to sacrifice the new life and basically raise them like cows for slaughter, and then use that ether to be able to revive their own people who first sacrificed themselves to Zodiark's creation. It's very difficult to say for sure if that plan would have actually worked, but given the circumstances, I do think that it is possible if they could just remove the souls that were being made up of Zodiark and just transfer them into new forms. It's certainly possible at the very least. Thankfully, this third sacrifice never came to be. because there were still some who disagreed in the forms of Vina and her followers. They believed that Zodiark was now a huge threat, and not only did they have to protect this new life, they also had to kind of force the remaining people to accept that this was their new reality. After the Convocation member Etheirys, who became Zodiark's heart, separated himself from Zodiark to resume his duties to restore order, Vina became a new primal in the form of Hydaelyn, using the sacrifices of her followers to become Zodiark's shackles until mankind could come up with a permanent solution to avert the final days. Because the thing is that so long as Zodiark was around, then this protective bubble around Etheirys would remain, and they wouldn't have to worry about the final days. But Vina knew that Zodiark would one day be defeated. He would one day be destroyed. And once he goes, then the final days would just pick up where they left off. Hydaelyn decided that the best option was simply to seal him away. So it was like she broke him up into many different forms and just sealed them in separate shards in different realities to make sure that his powers stuck around, but that we couldn't really use his powers for any more sacrifices. So after Vina became Hydaelyn, she and Zodiark did battle. And they fought until eventually Hydaelyn became the winner when she struck down Zodiark and ended up breaking the world in the process. She sundered it into the source and its 13 reflections. Not only that though, she also created the moon, which would serve as a prison for Zodiark, both here on the source and each one of the reflections, as well as creating the Loporrits, who would serve as stewards for humanity in case Zodiark was ever destroyed. There was also her familiar in the form of Argos, who would serve as a kind of watchdog over Zodiark's prison, and there was also the Watcher himself, who was created from an old friend of Vina's, who would be able to serve as the warden, or rather the jailer, for Zodiark's prison. So while Argos and the Watcher were left to watch over Zodiark's cradle, the Loporrits began to work upon the moon, where they would take thousands of years to actually convert the moon into a starship that would be able to ferry people across the cosmos in search of a new home, should mankind be unable to stop Meteon. But as for Etheirys itself, after the Great Sundering, the people were left as just pale shades of the people they once were. Everything, the world, the animals, even the people themselves, had their souls completely ripped apart and sundered into splinters and divided between the source and its shards. From this state, it led to the creation of different races, with no longer having near immortal lives, unable to use creation magics, and not even having any memories of their former existence. The source world became known as Hydaelyn after the primal, leaving its true name of Etheirys to be forgotten. As for Hydaelyn herself, she retreated into the ethereal sea to watch over it from a distance, to see if a day would come when mankind was ready to stand against despair. As for what was left of the Convocation, only 3 people were able to escape this sundering intact. The ones who bear the titles of Emek-Selch, Etheirys, and La Habrea. They decided that they would do whatever it took to restore Etheirys and their people at whatever the cost. To do this, they began their great work of the rejoining, basically trying to force the shards back into the source. By shattering the barriers between each shard and the source, they could force the worlds to rejoin together, thus wiping out the shards and fusing the ether back into the source, gradually recreating their home over time. It was then that they would later reform the Convocation, now as the Ascians, by finding the fragmented souls of their former comrades and restoring their memories of their former lives, thus regathering their brethren over and over. I'm guessing that after all of that, they probably spent a lot of time studying up on the source and each one of the reflections, trying to figure out the best way to be able to restore their home. We do know that their first attempt ended up as a disaster when it transformed the 13th shard into the World of Darkness, or the Void. We are still trying to learn the truth of how that all ended up happening, though even Emek-Selch admits that it was through their own impatience and lack of understanding the connection between the source and the shards that they ended up all but transforming the 13th into a lifeless void that cannot be rejoined to the source. But because of this event, they were able to figure out the proper process to retriggering a rejoining correctly. That's what led to a series of calamities upon the source that would gradually rejoin its shards one by one. As of right now, we had a total of 7 calamities and just barely managed to avoid an 8th. We were able to bring the first back from the brink of destruction, whereas some of the other shards weren't as lucky, in the forms of the 2nd, the 3rd, the 5th, the 6th, and the 10th shards. Unfortunately, were all rejoined. The ones that we believe are still safe are the 4th, the 8th, the 9th, and the 11th, with it kind of up in the air about the 13th, but there are some promising signs that even a lost world can still be saved. So, all in all, after the Sundering, life begins anew for even fragmented souls. A people that were once considered very powerful and intelligent race were reduced to primitive life forms struggling to survive in a world without any forms of creation magic to help them. This will continue on until the earliest forms of recorded history, which in turn will lead us to the first of many calamities and the continued cycle of life. Sadly, we must leave the lesson there for right now, but don't you worry, we will be moving on to the next lesson as soon as we can, which will lead to discussing everything we know of the first umbral era, or the calamity of wind, followed by the time of peace of the first astral era. I do plan on covering all the history that we know of so far, and I will have an entire series that will go into more details of each era, and those will all be coming out at regular intervals for the next year. I hope that you are all looking forward to it, and don't be late for the next class, but until next time everyone, may you walk in the light of the crystal.